Maxillary first premolar waxing. The maxillary first premolar has the mesial surface missing, and that will be built back in wax. It's a particularly interesting surface because of the unique characteristics present on the mesial surface of the maxillary first premolar, in that it has a marginal ridge groove. There's a large groove that crosses the marginal ridge and actually creates a depression in the groove, and that depression is continued onto the mesial surface of the crown, leading to a developmental depression on the mesial surface of the crown that's confluent with a large depression on the mesial surface of the root. And the typical thing that most teeth have is a developmental depression that's deeper on the distal surface of the crown and the root compared to the mesial surface. So this is an exception to that general rule, and you can see how the mesial marginal developmental groove actually creates a depression in the marginal ridge. So as we've done before, we'll start with the pencil and marking the height of contour by going around the proximal surface of the tooth from mesial to distal, the line showing the height of contour on that surface. Then we're also going to go down the mesial slope, the mesial cusp ridge, go down that slope until these two lines cross each other. And where those two lines cross each other, that represents our proximal contact point. We can measure that distance from the cusp tip to where that proximal contact is. That will be a guide for us. We also could take the depression that's present in the root of the tooth, because this is typically a two-rooted tooth, at least most of the time, and so there's a depression here in the mesial bifurcation, and you can measure from there up to the point and identify, first of all, the location of the proximal contact. So we'll transfer that root measurement, and there we know that this particular point, and so I'll scribe a little mark there that we can accentuate with our pencil, and that shows where the contact's located, and that will be the first area where we'll create a prominence of wax. And if we measure the mesiodistal dimension of the intact tooth, then we can use that dimension on the waxed tooth to determine if we have sufficient dimension there. And as I've done before, that carved away some of the wax, so now we have the proper mesiodistal dimension. The next step is to create our loop that goes to the facial cusp tip. It will go up the mesial cusp ridge of the facial cusp, transition into the marginal ridge, and then go up the mesial cusp ridge of the lingual cusp. And you can see on this tooth, which is characteristic of a first premolar, the lingual cusp tip is shorter than the facial cusp tip. So let's add our loops. First to the facial cusp, create our marginal ridge, and then transition that so that it traverses up to join the lingual cusp. And at this point you actually could tip the tooth up, and you could start looking at the contour from an occlusal view to see if you have sufficient wax added to the tooth. And you can see right here in this area where my fingernail is, we're a little bit deficient. So I just need to go back and add a little bit of wax to the lingual aspect of the surface, and that will give us sufficient bulk. Then the next item, as we've done before, let's mark the corners of the tooth with our pencil. First of all, the mesiofacial corner, and then the mesiolingual corner of the tooth. And we'll add those heights of contour to our waxed tooth. And let's do the lingual one. Once we've completed those, then the next step is to fill in the facial and lingual contours. And at this point, it's wise to compare the waxed tooth with the intact tooth to see if there's enough prominence in the area where the proximal contact is located. And it looks like we have sufficient prominence in that area. You also can notice on the intact tooth, if you go cervical to the proximal contact, you'll notice that there's a slight concavity in the crown of the tooth. So we want to make sure that we'll be able to carve that into the tooth, and I have a little excess wax that'll allow that carving to happen. So now let's move to the lingual portion of the tooth. Again, learning to apply it smoothly will help you. You can also look at the lingual contour now and see how they compare with each other. Next step is to fill in the center area where there will be eventually a substantial concavity in the surface of both the crown and the root. So I'm making sure that there's a little bit extra so I can carve the concavity, get the wax nice and smooth. Then we go to the occlusal surface and we'll fill in that area of the tooth. And I see I have that corner a little bit too rounded when I look at this view, so I'm adding just a little bit of wax out there with the smaller instrument so we can apply smaller amounts of wax. And we'll fill in the occlusal surface, this portion that's missing. And then we'll do some carving to see if we have enough wax and where there might be deficiencies, because most all these teeth, it's a process. You add some wax and you analyze the shape. You do some carving and you reanalyze. So now I will take the carving instrument on the facial surface, half on the plastic, half on the wax, and we'll go down the surface, and that will also delineate the cervical line. You can see how when you carve up this way, it just automatically creates for you by following the natural contour of the plastic. It creates the shapes that you're looking for. And this is a very soft bristle brush. The best one I know of is actually called a Nimbus brush, and not that I'm selling Nimbus brushes, but it's a very nice fine bristle brush for removing the wax. Go to the lingual surface, carve that wax away. Now let's go to the proximal surface and get rid of the wax there. And this is hard because you'll start running into the actual stand for this tooth. So you have to turn around and carve coming from the occlusal surface. So whenever the instrument runs into some piece of plastic, then switch around and carve from a different direction until you eliminate all the wax, and you'll see that automatically is starting to produce a substantial depression in the wax. And then we'll do a little smoothing of the transitions here, again from multiple directions to help us get it nice and smooth. And then start doing some comparisons again. I've done some initial carving. Let's look at it from the lingual surface, see if we like what we have here. And other than right down there by the cervical line, because I haven't carved that in there, that looks pretty nice. And then looking at the facial surface, and again, other than it's a little bit wide mesiodistally, you can see the dimension of the tooth is bigger, and I don't have the concavity. So I'm going to go back and remeasure that, because in that last edition I added too much wax. So there's our mesiodistal dimension on the intact tooth. So let's pick up the other tooth, and let's just do this. See, if I mark here, I can take my caliper, my Bowley gauge, and it creates a nice little groove in the tooth that tells me how much extra wax that I have to remove, because I added quite a bit too much. So I'll go back now and add or carve away the excess, get a smoother surface here. And there's still a little depression from where I scratched that surface. So again, you can take the fine instrument. And if you notice, there's one of these that has a very sharp point. And this really is not good for adding wax, but it's excellent for smoothing areas where you've scuffed up a surface or have a notch in it like I just did. So that real sharp end's good for smoothing the wax. And now we can take another look at the mesiodistal contour. It's closer to what we're looking for now, but I've got to create the concavity on the facial surface. To do that, it's best to hold the two teeth together and look at the one tooth. Look at the curvature, the carving there, and then go to the other tooth, the waxed one, and carve. Look back and forth. Continually study the intact tooth and carve away from the waxed tooth. And you can see we're starting to now create the right shape as far as the concavity goes in that tooth. It's kind of hard to rotate the two exactly the same, but you can see we're now pretty close. So I'm going to carve the cervical line, and at this point we can determine where should the cervical line be in the center. So again, go for your bifurcation. From there to the cervical line, we have a short distance, so I can take the wax tooth and I can go from the bifurcation, and there's where that should be. Then if I look at the cervical line, this one has some unique form, and we'd like to learn to replicate exactly what's there. So the cervical line comes around from the lingual, goes down into the depth of the bifurcation, then it moves occlusally, goes back down apically until we reach the facial surface. So we've got to carve that same type of form into there. Many instruments you can use. I've showed using the sharp carving instrument. You also could take this particular instrument that we'll use on the occlusal surface of posterior teeth, and we can carve in a cervical line like that. So that's another instrument that will work very effectively to carve a groove in the surface of the tooth. Then we can take our carving instrument and go ahead and smooth that out, create the right transition between the crown and the root of the tooth. And another little tip that you can do, you can take the wax adding instrument while it's cold, not hot, and it will function as a burnisher. And you can take that down into the surface, and notice if you apply medium pressure with this, not heated, it will burnish that transition, and you can make a nice transition from the root to the crown. So there are many ways you can carve this. Many instruments will work, but this is a particularly nice one for areas like this where you have a substantial concavity. So now I've created a reasonable transition from the crown to the root of the tooth, and I want to accentuate now the crown concavity, because we need a little bit more concavity than what I have. And you can again be studying your intact tooth while you're carving the wax tooth. And remember, that concavity goes right up and joins the marginal ridge. Now let's transition to the occlusal surface, and for a minute review the morphology on the occlusal surface of the intact tooth. We have two depressions. They're called fossae. We have a mesial fossa and a distal fossa. There's a central developmental groove between the two, and this central developmental groove doesn't go straight across the tooth. It rises up a little bit occlusally, then goes back down in the pit. And then there's a groove that comes out and crosses the marginal ridge, the mesial marginal ridge developmental groove. And then we have some other grooves that are developmental in nature and some smaller supplemental grooves. Developmental grooves separate the major components of a tooth, and the supplemental grooves then subdivide those major components by more shallow depressions. So it's nice to look straight down on these two teeth and do your carving that way. Take the sharp instrument, this little pointed cone, and carve those grooves into the tooth the way, just like you see them. Location, curvature, and then let's put the one that crosses the marginal ridge. We'll carve that into the tooth. And then we can brush those off. And you could see they're a little deep and artificial, but that's where we come back with our carving instrument and we round over the edges of each of those grooves. And you blend the surfaces into each other, because each one of these grooves separates a ridge. And the ridge, almost all ridges on all teeth are slightly convex. They're not concave. And so we just round those over, leaving the little peak on the ridge between the grooves. And now we want to compare our waxed tooth with the intact tooth to see where we are, and we're getting pretty close to what we're looking for. A little rounding and smoothing here, and we will be in pretty good shape. And I see down in the surface here, do you notice? I have an air bubble. You notice that little dark spot? That's a little air bubble where I didn't coalesce two increments of wax. So again, take the little sharp explorer-like tip and heat that up, and then just go down in that area and very quickly just touch the wax and it will flow it together for you very nicely. Then you can go back and you can recarve that to smooth it with your little cone-shaped instrument. And I still see a defect. There's actually a fairly large bubble, so I'm going to actually add just a tiny bit of wax down in there because I didn't get it all flowed together. So there we go. And we'll refine that. And then it's time to study the morphology. Let's look at those two. What do we see that's different between the two? I notice that this tooth has a continual curvature here and a curvature on this surface that's kind of a continuous convexity, lingual to the mesial marginal developmental groove. And mine looks a little bit more prominent. It's a little more bulbous than the intact tooth. So I'm going to just carve while I'm looking at the two. And I'll keep checking that until we get rid of that extra bulbous nature there. Still needs a little bit more. Notice how I carve from different directions, and that gives you a smooth, uniform surface as opposed to one that gets ridges or ripples in it. So we're now pretty close, and now I want to take the mesial view because we want to look at this and make sure that we have a depression, that mesial marginal developmental groove does in fact cross the marginal ridge. So it looks like we have now completed except for the final smoothing and polishing. Maxillary first premolar polish. After completing the final carving and polishing of the maxillary first premolar, we can compare the mesial surface with that of the intact tooth. We follow a number of features around the tooth. First of all, we'll look at where the cusp tip is located and the cusp ridge, the mesial cusp ridge. We go around the mesial surface until we traverse along the marginal ridge until we reach the mesial marginal developmental groove. And then you'll notice that the marginal ridge lingual to that mesial marginal developmental groove has a little bit of a convexity to it. Actually, you can see a little S-shaped curve there in that particular form that's present in the natural tooth. And then we'll turn it around to the lingual view. Make sure we have the proper cervical convergence to the wax pattern. And review the mesial surface where we have that large mesial developmental crown depression that transitions into a root depression. And we'll rotate those around again. Use your light, the movement of the tooth, so that you get the light reflecting off of the tooth to see what it is. And now let's do a little more detailed light reflection movement of just the tooth itself. So you can see the concavity on the crown that's confluent with the concavity on the root. You can see the corners of the tooth, the mesiofacial corner and the mesiolingual corner of the tooth, and the light reflecting off the marginal ridge. And as we come around the facial surface, you can also notice that there's a little bit of a developmental depression on the facial surface of this tooth. So we would call that a facial developmental groove, or because it's a posterior tooth, you could also call it a buccal developmental depression that's separating that center lobe of the tooth with the mesial portion.